So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Cotton Connected session, which is entitled The Power to Empower. I hope many of you know who I am, but I'm Bill Kingdon, the Managing Director of the ICA, and it's my delight to be here today with such a strong panel, and a few more words about them will follow in just a moment. As part of the Women in Cotton mission to improve diversity throughout the cotton industry, not just for women, it's a real privilege for me to welcome such a diverse and experienced group of panelists to this session today, all of whom share a commitment to unlocking the potential in individuals and developing high-performing teams. And they've all built up a wealth of experience in how to use diversity to benefit those teams and to allow and to generate a more effective performance. So these are our panelists today. Azeez Syed, of course, a recent president of the ICA, managing director and regional head of Olam Global Agri. Konstantinos, Dimitriou, on my immediate left, general manager at Vamvaki, and how many generations, what generation of your family firm are you?
Third.
Third generation of a family firm dedicated to the cotton industry. Stephanie Silber, managing director of Otto Stadtlabder, but also the very first female president of the Bremen Baumwollbörse. And so it's a particular pleasure to have you here with us, Stephanie. William Barksdale, president of Cargill Cotton, and one of our directors of the ICA. And the final panelist, Katie Farren, cotton trader of Louis Dreyfus. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The focus we've given for ourselves today is this question of what is allyship? This has been a particular area of investigation and exploration by the Women in Cotton group throughout this year. And these short bullets on the screen here are our distillation, perhaps, of what we feel allyship means to all of us. I want to highlight just a couple of points. Building relationships is perhaps at the heart of this, and particularly relationships that empower and strengthen the confidence of underrepresented individuals or groups. We think it's important to note we can't mark our own homework here. I can't say I'm good at allyship. That's for others to say. It's not self-defined, it's defined by the effectiveness of those who work with us, around us, or live with and around us. I think it's important we all appreciate, actually, there's so much for us to learn and to gain from this journey of discovering about empowering groups and about trying to be a good ally. Actually, it's as much, this turns out to be as much of a benefit for us as it does for any individual in our team. So that's a very quick overview of what our starting point is. What is allyship? Sorry, I need to go back here, don't I? So this panel, my goal is to throw a few questions to the panel and have a conversation. And it's a conversation, please, that we'd very much like to involve all of you in the room. If you were in the first session, you would have seen the Slido QR code, which allows you to enter questions anonymously on your mobile devices. Please do use that. It'll pop up from time to time. Pop your questions in there if you have any. But also feel free just to stand up and ask a question and enter this conversation as well, because that's what we're trying to achieve. Now, we've all got personal experiences of allyship, of developing teams and others. And I remember personally, as a young man who had no idea what I wanted to do in life, there was an important ally in my life who was a friend of my family who helped to kind of steer my enthusiasms and my what limited talents I had as a teenager growing up, and helped me focus on what became my profession for the next 36 years. And there is no doubt, without the influence of this individual, the gentle encouragement, the challenge, and the reinforcing conversations, then an important step in my life wouldn't have taken place. And I'm sure we've all got similar experiences, and we can remember people who've been great allies and supporters and mentors to each of us. So let me ask the panelists, what have been your personal experiences? How have you experienced allyship in your career? Perhaps start with Stephanie. I think you've had a particularly joyful experience recently of being an ally and playing back an allyship experience.
Exactly, playing back. Yes, I want to share this personal experience with you. I started my career in the cotton industry 22 years ago. I was a commercial trainee. It's very common in Germany to make an apprenticeship, and at the end of the apprenticeship there's a final exam. In Bremen we have a foundation supporting young people and encouraging them to make such a commercial career in the industry and the companies. And they are giving a good surrounding for the young people by teaching the people involved for the surrounding, for example, if you have language barriers or so on. But another target of the foundation is to award the best final exams. So as a young person, it's a nice incentive to get a nice amount, an award, and be on a stage to hear your name for this. So I received such an award 20 years ago.
Okay.
And last year I was elected on the advisory board of the foundation, so now I'm on the other side. Just last week there was a ceremony where the young people got their checks and their awards, and next year it will be my part to hand it over and to make the speech for them.
To make the presentation that you yourself received 20 years ago.
Yes.
Now that's fantastic, isn't it? And it shows that circle of both being a beneficiary and then being able to pay back. Katie, as a young woman in the cotton industry, how have you benefited from allyship in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't have as much experience as Stephanie does. I've been in the industry now about 5.5 years. Each of those years I've spent at LDC. And I have been incredibly lucky over the course of that 5 years to have benefited from many mentors throughout that time. These mentors have been in a very informal setting, so it's not necessarily a formal mentorship program, but that has allowed me to build these relationships with many people at my company who support and push me to gain confidence and strengthen my abilities as a trader. So these mentors, whether it's pushing me to engage in certain discussions or ask questions on a global call, whether it's offering my name up when certain opportunities come up to work on a project or to gain new responsibilities. All of these things have pushed me to gain confidence in my time. And I think, you know, we talk about what is allyship, and it is a lifelong process of building relationships and building trust. And that has certainly been something that over 5 years I've benefited from quite a bit. I think these relationships and mentors that I've had don't necessarily make a conscious choice every day to say, oh, I'm going to check in on Katie, or oh, I'm going to push her to be involved in this project. But these unconscious choices that these mentors are making end up having a huge impact on myself and any other young woman who's in the industry.
Have any of those experiences made you, have been difficult, pushed you to a place that you really didn't want to go? And how was that experience?
I think not necessarily, because, you know, in an informal mentorship or sponsorship is what we tend to call it when we're discussing allyship. It's a give and take, right, with any relationship in a work setting. So when you're being pushed, when you're being challenged, you want to be pushed past your comfort zone. And I think having that has definitely pushed me to take strides that without these mentors I wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
I know for me, at some stages in my early life, it felt uncomfortable to stand up in front of people and to be in the spotlight, perhaps, make a presentation or to speak about something. But actually, as I look back, you know, those were very formative experiences. Gives you the confidence to do it again and again, doesn't it? If you know actually it's less frightening the second time, that actually people want you to succeed, and you lose some of the fears that perhaps you experienced early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even in a conversation where you know, you're invited into a meeting or someone introduces you and helps you network in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity. You know, even having a call with somebody and they say, hey, in that meeting yesterday, you didn't really offer up your opinion. Why not? All of these things are not necessarily conscious decisions that mentors or leaders are making, but they absolutely help a young woman or anybody who's young in the industry trying to gain confidence.
Absolutely. Thank you. So looking at that definition of what practical and effective steps can be taken, William, can you tell us a bit about any steps that you've identified that help an ally, and what can we all learn from that to be better allies ourselves?
Sure, Bill. Thanks for the question, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think, man, I'll tell you, I was going to answer that question one way, and just as I've heard these great examples in the past 5 minutes, to me, that's the root of allyship, is just taking the pause, creating the space to be able to sit and just listen on what allyship means to people. Because that's, you know, as a 50-year-old white male, I can have an opinion on what allyship is that is completely wrong or doesn't serve the purpose at all. So I think really just taking the moment to understand and check in with others on what it means to them is super important in the first step. I also think, too, that it's really important to draw this distinction between advocacy and allyship. I think particularly, you know, knowing the personalities in a lot of the cotton trading businesses, you know, having a strong voice has been an important part of our business, or at least part of our culture. And that strong voice normally shows up, I think, in the form of advocacy. We see something, a right that we think we need to wrong, right, or some way that we need to step in and fix something, and we use our voice. And that's advocacy, but that's not allyship. I think allyship is really taking a moment to pause and again check in and listen and learn first, and then think about how you can support the group that you're working with.
That's a really interesting distinction. And have you seen any examples of where understanding that distinction has helped you to intervene in a particular way? I don't want to put you on a spot here, but...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of my responsibilities, and I should say opportunities with Cargill, is to serve as the executive lead for diversity, equity, inclusion in North America. And again, right, it's an opportunity I've had in the past 2 years. I stepped into the role, again, with 30 years of experience and you know, a lot of privilege that I've had, which we'll probably talk about in a minute. But I think being able to check that experience and that privilege at the door and just listen and learn and check in and figure out how I can best serve the groups that I'm working with, and then use my privilege as a way to help advance that, is really the opportunity that I've had. I
think there's a theme there, and the underlying theme in part is humility, and which I know will come out during this conversation. Konstantinos, is there anything more you want to add to this point?
Yeah, so I think it's very important to actively keep learning about allyship. And we need to sometimes also be able to unlearn things that we know or we think we know. So this process of us continuously talking about it and continuously trying to educate ourselves in allyship makes us, puts us in a better position to really help and have impact.
I like that idea about unlearning. Yes, I've an awful lot of unlearning to do personally, but perhaps more of that later. Why is having allyship important to you personally and to your organization, Azeez? Can you tell us something about that?
Sure, Bill. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure being here. Look, I think before we look at why allyship is important for organizations, I think it's important to set the context for what diversity and inclusion really means for organizations. Because on the surface, if you look at it, the initial impetus for diversity and inclusion appears to be a social purpose. But then increasingly organizations are now believing and looking at inclusion and diversity as an element of growth, right? As a platform to build a competitive edge. Right? Now, there's abundant amount of research out there which establishes how diversity and inclusion really sets organizations apart while competing. Right? There's a McKinsey research which has been going on since 2014 across more than 1,000 organizations across 15 countries, which clearly establishes that organizations in the top quartile for diversity and inclusion in their leadership teams are 48% more likely to outperform than organizations in the fourth quartile. Right? That clearly establishes a business case for why organizations should focus on diversity and inclusion. Now, having said that, there are different elements to how you look at or how you drive an agenda for diversity and inclusion agenda as an organization. There's at the top of the pyramid, you need to have a compelling and a well-articulated leadership vision, commitment, management accountability. Then you need to be able to link that vision to a growth strategy. And then the third stage, you need to be able to identify clear deliverable priorities or strategic priorities for the organization to drive that agenda. And then you need a delivery mechanism. And that's where, to me, allyship really falls in. I mean, allyship it's easily relatable, all right? It's scalable, repeatable, a cost-effective delivery platform of driving and delivering on diversity and inclusion agenda. So that's why it's important to me personally, and that's where I think it's important not just for my organization, for any organization.
Are there forms of allyship, Katie, that you think everybody can apply?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so often we feel that in order to be an ally, in order to improve diversity in your organization, you need to be someone in a leadership position, because then you have the power to make strategic changes. And of course, these are imperative, they're important, we need them. We need leaders who want to promote diversity and inclusion, but everybody can be an ally, regardless of where you stand and how much power you have. I think an example of that would be, in our industry especially, information is power. So if you have access to a grower or a mill and you get information from them about something happening in the market, often you could think maybe someone will take this and hold that information close to their chest in order to be the shining star. But to be able to take that information and share it with your group, share it with somebody who doesn't necessarily have the same connections, who doesn't have the same access as you, the team and the organization does better. It benefits everybody. So I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with allyship, that it's about building trust and focusing on building relationships with people, and over time, sharing that information really does help benefit the team and the organization as a whole.
And I think that plays back into your point, Azeez, doesn't it, about the framework and structure. That structure in part needs a feedback loop, doesn't it, and the ability for people to be accepting of information that perhaps not expecting.
Not just that, I mean, it's, one is to set and drive an agenda, and you need to have clear metrics and deliverables that are set in terms of how you're going to measure progress. One is to set priorities, but then a lot of times where we fall short is, I mean, how do we set those metrics which are easily understood, well communicated, and then and which drives people on that agenda.
Again, putting you on the spot, can you think of any metrics in the area of allyship that really helps? Because it's mainly about personal relationships, isn't it? How can we measure? I mean, I know personally, I've worked in hierarchical organizations, and hierarchical organizations tend to create situations where people agree with each other, because that's how you get stuff done quickly often. But of course, nothing is more damaging, nothing is easier to outmaneuver than an organization that's not listening or not adaptable to unexpected situations. I'm sure that is played out in all of our.
Yeah, we don't look. We don't need to look very far, Bill. You remember back in 2019 when we were looking at this very institution's board. We had 0 directors on the board of ICA, and then we discussed at the board, and we said this is a clear agenda that we need to set, and we need to find talent and bring them on the board and diversify the board. And today, I mean. And we set clear metrics. We said at least 2 women directors by this year, and we said over this time frame, a woman president of ICA. I mean, today, look, I mean, since there were clear metrics and there's a clear focus on that, today we have, 4 directors on the board, and then in a couple of years or a year, we're going to have the first ICA president ever. So as long as your vision is clear, your metrics are clear, and then you have a delivery mechanism, I think you'll get there.
So yesterday we set some diversity metrics for the ICA board, in fact, not just for the board, for the wider organization, and we do try and hold ourselves to account, don't we, by measuring
and
our
not just
success.
the board, right? I mean, we have a lot greater representation on various committees today, which never was the case.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can I take the conversation a little bit now onto privilege? Privilege and power for the person who wants to be an ally. Are they obstacles or assets? How do we balance the privileges and powers that may or may not be possessed in any individual with the obligation to be good allies? Would anyone like to kick off on that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, Bill. I mean, I think that to your first question, is it an asset or liability? I think if we're blind to it, if we don't recognize it, I think it's liability. I think first understanding what privilege is, and then understanding how an individual has benefited from privilege is the first step in that. And then the second step is, once you move into this allyship journey and really understand the perspective of the parties, and how can you use your privilege that you've had to be able to help out and be able to understand, right? If that's indeed welcome or needed by the other group.
Sorry, Konstantinos, please pile in.
Privilege is power, right? And we are very privileged in this room here and to be participating in this event. And we have to recognize that, and we need to take this opportunity to show what we take from here back in our corporations, in our social lives, and educate people in that as well.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely right. I guess I'm just thinking as we speak, really, of how of the responsibility of people to be receptive allies. This is a two-way street, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. We need all all our allies. We need all the people in our organizations to be open to both to be allies and to be helped and assisted by allies themselves. I think that's a point. And the example I've got in my head is actually it's a volunteer organization in Liverpool where I live, and the organization struggled as it came out of COVID, out of the lockdown. It's a performing arts organization, and we hadn't been together for a long time. And the leader of this group really found it very difficult to adapt to the new environment, to bring the team back together, and to foster a collaborative approach as we got together after the experiences of the lockdown. And that was a person who wasn't actually open to being assisted, to seeking advice, and to developing a team that could help him maneuver through an organization, through an environment that he hadn't experienced before. None of us had experienced it before, but all of us needed really collaboration and these principles of allyship to be successful. We struggled at that point because of the lack of openness and receptiveness, I think, in a key individual. Let me move on to our next point. We see from all the academic data, but I think also from your own experiences, how an inclusive and diverse culture helps better decision making and makes things more productive as well, and makes your companies more productive. Does this match your experience, William? And are there any particular examples that you can show where this diversity has led to commercial?
Yeah, for sure. And I look at that too. I have the advantage of being around the trade for 30 years and the disadvantage of being around the trade for 30 years. And I look at the teams, and I make these statements not looking at anybody but myself and my experience in the room, to be clear. But I look at my experiences when I was a young trader, 25 years ago, and they were typically all males in the room. And it wasn't and most of the time decisions were made not necessarily by intellect, but by the amount of bravado somebody had in making their point. And I think that's an important distinction to make. There's a difference between bravado and intellect. And then I look at the teams that I have the privilege to lead now that are diverse. And not everybody has a strong voice, but there is a tremendous amount of intellect in the room. And really and my role is not to have the voice, but to try to pull and encourage voices to speak up and create the safe space to do that. And then watching the results and the culture that develops from that. And I think, where we are now is exponentially better than where it was a number of years ago. Right? And it's all about just creating that space to give, for people to speak up.
And this is about culture of the organizations, isn't it? And I want to just explore for a minute that relationship between culture change and allyship. Do we need allyship to get culture change? Do we need a good culture to allow allyship to thrive? How does that dynamic work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think allyship is an enabler in culture change. I think culture is set by three things. Culture is set by who you recognize, by who you reward, and by who you retain in an organization. Those are the three areas that are really going to drive culture and drive culture change. But allyship, if you think about it, going along, working in tandem with that process, and then recognizing, rewarding, and retaining those that are being allies can really take your culture to a next level, I believe.
Stephanie, Katie, anything more you'd like to say about your experiences of culture and allyship?
Yeah, I think it's almost a little bit like a chicken and the egg type situation when we discuss whether culture brings about allyship or if allyship brings about culture change at a company. And maybe it's the easy answer, but I really do think it's both. In my experiences at LDC, on the one hand, in terms of culture, we have a very, very much so one team, one goal approach to the cotton platform at LDC. And I think that's something that our leadership has instilled in everybody. And they've created a very flat structure where everybody, whether it's a country manager or a trader trainee, is encouraged and expected to participate, to ask questions, to engage. And that kind of dynamic really does help someone who usually would not feel the confidence to voice their opinion or doesn't feel like there's someone in the room who should be sharing their opinion. That absolutely helps to create allyship and foster allyship at our company. Then on the other hand, where allyship can affect culture change at an organization, a specific example is, at LDC we have a trader trainee program where we hire new fresh graduates every year. And a few years ago, someone I work closely with in our Memphis office helped take over managing recruitment for that program for the US. And he made it his goal to really go and try to target and expand the applicant pool in order to ensure that we had the most diverse applicant pool when they're reviewing applications, interviewing candidates, to make sure that every year when we're hiring new people, it's diverse in whether that's gender, whether it's race, whether it's ethnicity, or even what people studied at school. All of these things are making us more successful as a platform, to have more diverse candidates, and ensuring that our culture is going to be better in the office and more diverse. And I think that's something where, you need to ensure, as Azeez was mentioning earlier, that these are repeatable as well. It's one thing to send applications or job postings out one year to a greater number of schools as one actionable item, but it's about repeatedly year after year ensuring that you have a more diverse applicant pool and more diverse candidates that you're hiring.
That's a great example. Stephanie?
Actually, nothing to be added.
Nothing more. Nothing more. That's good. But a very positive example too. I think we'll come back to that to some degree. Do you think gender equality, diversity, the issues we're talking about are more intuitive for a younger generation? Is it a generational issue, or are we falling into a trap of assuming that one generation is different or better than another? What do you think about this, Konstantinos?
I think that it's both again. So it is a trap. It's not only the young generation that actually is actively participating in this discussion. Or we are very lucky to have the ground set from the previous generations, and they have done their part, enabling us to be able to have these discussions today. Yes, as we have been discussing with Katie a lot, within the younger generation, we do have these discussions more frequently, more openly. We're not afraid to even become a little bit uncomfortable within the discussions to push the envelope. But to do that, the previous generations laid the ground for that.
Right, I think, at least in my opinion, younger generations do have a tendency to care more about social issues, and gender diversity and gender equality is a big player in that, in any conversation about social issues. It is more innate, I think, in our generation to want and fight for gender equality in a workplace, but I do believe that the reason we are able to think about it innately is because of the work that's been done by the generations before us, by Stephanie and Emer and Kim in the cotton industry, for example, paving the way for young women to want a seat at the table, for men in the industry who have also been fighting for this. It really comes down to how we're educating younger generations. And if you educate from a young age that gender equality is something that we shouldn't hope for, but we should expect, then it does become innate.
With Katie, we were part of the first Aspire, right? Which the ICA created this platform for the younger generation to communicate, participate, know each other, and actually give them a platform to actually show themselves. And this is the active way that the older generation is helping the younger generation do this kind of interacting and create knowledge and make us more experienced in allyship in the future. Or, for example, during this conference, you have a lot of young speakers, right? In a lot of the different industries, that's not the case. Usually, you only have the very high-end experts, the very top guns of the industry participating in these events. Whereas here, you are pushing the envelope to promote the younger generation, like Katie and myself.
Well, that's good to hear, and thank you for the plug. But I know, speaking personally, and I know Azeez was involved, like me to some small degree, in the Aspire program. I found it particularly valuable and inspiring and helpful too, not only to hear different perspectives from really capable people all over the world, but it is the energy that comes off a group of capable young people is unsurpassed, I think. Do you agree, Azeez?
Oh, absolutely. It was an amazing experience. I mean, getting this, all these young people together, sharing your experiences, and just looking at the energy in that room, and it's the confluence of ideas. It was awesome 2 years of two programs.
And it plays out in so many other ways too, doesn't it? I mean, actually, I think my point is we can all benefit from the conversations, from the energy, from sharing ideas, and from being challenged. It may not always, I don't always feel comfortable being challenged. Perhaps that's a normal human reaction, but it's usually good for us. And challenge our perceptions, our preconceptions. We're going to come on to talking for a minute about the ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to identify perhaps what an individual or a group might be experiencing. And I'll start with a personal experience where I felt I didn't do this very well. I worked for a particularly strong leader who had incredibly fixed goals for the organization, and he had a very aggressive timetable, and he was incredibly demanding as a boss. And I know that for some of the people that worked for me, they lived in constant fear of this individual, and I felt that my role as a senior-ish leader between the team who was doing a great deal of the work and him was to prevent perhaps some of the unhelpful characteristics of the character and the style of leadership from impacting on their own work. But I failed to understand with one or two key individuals just actually how unsuccessful that could be. Actually, my goal wasn't to try and protect, but actually to better empathize and to better understand their day-to-day experience and then to work with them to make it better. Rather than to put myself as a buffer between the two. And at the end, I had a very open and frank, or one of my colleagues had a very open and frank conversation with me saying, did you fully understand just how difficult I found that experience? Whilst the outcome was demonstrably quite successful, the mission was achieved, but the manner and the casualties perhaps along the way, the impact on the individual had been more profound than I experienced. It was a very hastening experience for me. So, you know, have any of you got experiences or can recall a time when you had the chance to be an ally, but you didn't take the right action, or something held you back from acting? And if you're in that situation again, what have you learned from that? Azeez, is that something you'd like to start on?
Sure. Well, look, again, I'll draw on another McKinsey survey report I was leading last night, which actually set me thinking. Now, amongst these organizations, the same 1,000 organizations which were surveyed, now 86% of the organizations claim to have some kind of a sponsorship program to promote diversity and inclusion, right? And in the same setup, when the employees from underrepresented groups were surveyed, less than 40% of the employees actually felt that they sponsored. So there's a huge disconnect there. And that's where I think as organizations we need to address how do we really make these programs very effective. So that set me thinking last night, and I was looking at, reflecting a little bit at the programs that we have within Olam. And I think we have a couple of really compelling employee resource groups. There's one called EDGE, which is focused on ethnic diversity and inclusion, and then there's another one called GROW, which is, I think, an acronym for Global Reach of Olam Women, all right? And the entire agenda for GROW is to promote gender diversity through 3 essential sub-programs, which is mentorship, creating developmental pods, and then recognition. Now, as a head of region, I do have a privileged position. So using that privileged position, I did contribute to setting up these employee resource groups, right? But when I really reflected on, okay, what have I done beyond that? And how actively have I engaged with these resource groups, and how much I have personally contributed. And I had the opportunity to be a mentor on several different occasions. I think I do mentoring on an informal way, but then I have really formally taken on mentorship assignments in a structured manner, no. And I said, why didn't I do that? I mean, the most easy refrain is, I don't have the time. Well then, is that true? I mean, if you're really passionate about it or committed to that agenda, you'll find the time, right? But I said, why didn't I do it? I mean, I don't have the time, but I don't think that's true. I mean, it's just lack of commitment, right? So that's one that struck. And then a lot of times, organizations, we do see this microaggressions, right? We do see toxic behavior or inappropriate behavior. That's true about every organization. That's true about Olam as well. Now, how do you react and what do you do in those situations, right? I mean, and usually the subjects of this toxic behavior is typically underrepresented, people from the underrepresented segments. Now, there's several different ways you can approach and address that. I mean, the easiest way is to try and shield them, right? But the more difficult ones are to actually stand out there and call out such toxic behavior, right? And even more difficult is actually to ally with those underrepresented employees and then help them build the ability to deal or combat the toxic behavior. Then when I look back at in such situations, what have I done? I probably acted in some form and manner to shield them. But have I really stood out and called out that kind of behavior? No. Have I really engaged with those people to help them build those skills to really combat that? No. And why? Because probably you don't want conflict, or you don't want situations which mean consequences for you. Now, and it's important within organizational situations that people actually stand out there and call out such behavior without fear of consequence or fear of conflict. And I think that's really, really critical in terms of really driving the agenda on an allyship program.
To add on Azeez's point, we have to understand that allyship is an action. It's a verb, and in doing so, we are going to fail, and there will be error. And in order to become a more effective ally, and we need to be aware of that we have to put ourselves in that position of failing, and we mustn't fear saying or doing the wrong thing, which would prevent us being an ally. We should embrace that and speak up our minds and be aware and always push the envelope, even if sometimes we're wrong.
Yeah. I think there's there's 2 great points come out of here. One is courage. We need the courage. We need leaders with courage. We need individuals with courage, both to do the wrong thing with good motivation, but also to put ourselves in difficult positions. when that's required?
Sure. I mean, see, I think there is general good intent, right? And there is empathy for around the organizations for the diversity and inclusion programs. But intent and empathy without affirmative action counts for nothing.
Absolutely. And the second point I was going to bring was the learning, the willingness to be open to new ideas, to be open to learning, and to learn from all of those around us. You touched on, William, a really interesting point we hadn't developed yet, which is about creating a safe environment for colleagues. And I wondered if you'd like to tell us a bit about psychological safety and how you think this is best promoted in organizations.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Bill. So psychological safety, I think, is kind of the cornerstone of this allyship and really pulling together diverse teams and creating these spaces where all voices can be heard. Because I think underpinning that culture is just the feeling that people can express their own thoughts and ideas without fear of retaliation, being made fun of, humiliation, whatever the word is that you want to pick. And I think that's a really big deal. And I think that there's a couple ways. I'd build quickly on what Azeez touched on these toxic environments. And sometimes they're toxic without really intentional toxicity, but they just happen to be that way. But I think finding ways and having the courage to speak up and call that out in a productive way, maybe behind closed doors when you see behavior that you think has negative impacts on people is a big deal, right? And that's a first step. But I think it also can look like just in meetings, just there are voices that aren't as comfortable speaking up as others around the table. And just ensuring that, as a leader, you were seeing that, you're recognizing, you're understanding why. Katie brought that up on some coaching she received in her beginning comments. I think also calling on people, just creating an environment where people can bring that their ideas out in meetings is important in creating this psychological safe environment.
I think that's a great theme to leave this section of the conversation. Before we leave this discussion, we wanted to highlight perhaps a few actionable points that we felt could be taken away from this conversation today and perhaps played out in all of our organizations. And so we've taken just 5 actionable points. There are many others. I'm sure you could think of better ones. The first is becoming a sponsor, championing an individual. Stephanie, could you say a little bit about this action?
Sponsoring is being actively involved in aiding someone's career progression and continuing this by mentoring and providing advice.
Thank you. So next, calling out inappropriate behavior. Azeez, you raised this great point. Yeah. Build on this, will you please?
Yeah, I think I touched upon that already, Bill. And in the sense that, look, it's extremely important, particularly when you're dealing with underrepresented groups, LGBTQI in the organizations who typically tend to be targeted with toxic behavior. It's important to muster courage and have the conviction to stand up there, call that out, right? And pursue punitive actions against that. And then actively support and help them to develop the skill set to combat it. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, timeliness and that courage and time, acting in the moment and appropriately is important, isn't it? Next, an action we want to foster here is recognizing privilege and using it to amplify underrepresented voices. William, I think you raised this point.
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit at the beginning. I would just reiterate, I think just everybody, I would encourage everybody just to pause and understand the privilege that you have, and then further pause and understand how you can use that to support other groups and then move into action. So I think that's the opportunity.
Katie, I want you to just remind us about the example you gave earlier about trying different recruitment methods as a positive way of empowering others.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think an easy example would be putting out your job posting to different areas that you wouldn't necessarily post it, using different, tools to make sure that job postings are getting out to minority groups who wouldn't otherwise see it. There are ways to, hire groups that will help you phrase job postings that would end up, pushing somebody who otherwise would look over it to actually click and apply. You can also have members of your team who are a part of minority groups on the recruitment teams to understand how to better access those underrepresented groups.
Great point.
So there's definitely a lot you can do.
Thank you. And finally, actively seeking out alternative points of view. Perhaps something that chimes particularly with me, Konstantinos.
Well, we need to keep challenging ourselves to cross-examine our own biases. We need to think out of the box, put ourselves into other shoes. We cannot assume what others need. We have to discuss it with them. We should practice the art of listening, and through challenging ourselves, we actually educate ourselves and become more capable in allyship.
A great point. Thank you.
Hey, Bill, I'd like to just build on something Katie said. I have some energy around. I think the point Katie brought up around evaluating your job descriptions, your job postings, and ensuring you're using gender-neutral language and casting a wide net is super, super important. I know one thing, a statistic that I recently heard is that a male will post for a job if he feels that he meets 20 or 30% of the qualifications. But a female will post for a job if she feels like she meets 90% of the qualifications. So understanding how you're really crafting that is a way to really generate, I think, more postings for your positions.
And that chimes with me. I've had these conversations with my daughter as she's been applying for jobs, saying exactly the same things. I've been encouraging her to take a more male-focused approach to job hunting. But yeah, great point. Now, as we come to the end now, I've asked each of the panelists to think of one key takeaway for the audience today. So this will be our final slide, our final point, and I just can't remember who said what. So let's start with Katie at the top of the list here.
Yeah, I think if we can all work together and help each other to become better team members and therefore leaders, it's a great way if we just focus on one team working together and trying to access the opinions of underrepresented and minority groups, the organization and team will become stronger.
Thanks, Katie. William.
Energy and creativity, more voices, different perspectives, all with the psychological safety to speak up is going to lead you to better results. I believe that.
Thank you. Konstantinos.
We need to embrace our vulnerabilities. We need to keep challenging ourselves, not be afraid to make mistakes, and put ourselves out there to become better allies.
Thank you. Azeez.
Different points of view, Bill, I think extremely important for the business, because when you have a diverse set of people, it brings in different perspectives, which substantially improves your quality of decision making, because you have so many different perspectives to that when you approach an issue. One. Second thing is a diverse group has a more nimble, adaptive approach towards, changing consumer trends or changing consumption patterns, etc. So overall, it makes you more nimble, improves the quality of your decision making.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Understand allyship as advantage for the persons involved and for the organization.
It's that multi-directional thing. It's not just good for the person being allied, it's good for the ally, it's good for the organization as a whole. Great points. Well, thank you all very much indeed. Now is an opportunity for questions. Please use the Slido. We've got a couple of minutes for any questions that we might have. So taking that first one, that's clearly Stephanie and Katie. What would you say has been your biggest challenge, and how can we change that for the next generation? Stephanie, do you want to kick off on that?
Biggest challenge. So if you understand a challenge always as an advantage to improve yourself, then all the then it's always good. But I don't remember a special story.
That's fine. Katie.
I think probably the biggest challenge I would have faced is, finding and gaining that confidence to be willing to step up and have your voice heard in a room of people that don't necessarily look like you, if you're the only woman in a room or one of the few women in a room. And again, I think being at an organization or with a team that really supports and helps and mentors and sponsors you, that has helped me very much to overcome that.
Great. It looks like that top question is aimed right at you, Azeez. If there's a business case for executive diversity, Olam looks male.
Look, diversity has several different elements to that, right? It need not necessarily be gender diversity. While I'll be the first one to put my hand up and admit that on that aspect we failed as an organization. We've got a long way to go. But then diversity is ethnic, cultural, racial, gender diversity. And if you really look at the executive leadership team, I think it's ethnically, racially pretty diverse team. Gender, we failed miserably. We have a long way to go. So that's has to become an organizational priority for us. But if you really look at a board, at the Olam board level, that's gender, ethnic, race, culturally, probably one of the most diverse boards you can come across.
So you just need that woman, and then it'll be complete. The top question here, and I think we're probably going to finish off on this question, raises, it seems to me, several points. How does allyship and peer competition relate? I think there's a point here about competitiveness versus allyship. How do we get that culture? Or how can each of us contribute to getting that culture balance right? And then there's an interesting point about everyone is not allowed an ally. I suppose there's a perception here that allyship is best in a framework. I don't know, I may be misunderstanding the question, but there are a lot of themes in that question. Who would like to kick off with?
I think, this is a really important question, right? Because it goes back to what many of us have now discussed of focusing on a team and improving the organization. And you can't avoid competition between peers or between coworkers. Of course, it's going to come up at some point. But if you have a culture at an organization that's a flat structure or one that really promotes working for the team, then allyship kind of falls out of that. You have people who are wanting to support and help each other, and not just, allyship doesn't just have to be for men in the industry supporting women. Diversity is something that's extremely important in many different facets. And I think that having that one team, one goal, focusing on the team really does dissipate some of the competition that you would see otherwise.
Thank you. Konstantinos.
So there is this perception, and men usually have that perception, that in order to be allies and to have an impact, they need to do more. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes they just have to do less. And that's not a man or female thing. It's how we have to operate within an organization. And of course, everyone can be an ally. Every little action you take every day leans towards, that's a positive, that has a positive net value, leads into allyship.
Any other points to raise on that great question? Well, I think it just rests for me to say a great thank you to the 5 diverse, experienced, and great protagonists in this quest to have the power to empower. Thank you very much indeed for participating.
Thank you, Bill. The pleasure was mine.
Good job. Awesome. Good job.
Very good. I think the next step, I haven't looked at my program. What time is the next? Can anybody remind me?
Lunchtime.
2 o'clock. So break for lunch now, back on at 2 o'clock for the next regional panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.